All right, everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Quarantine Journals, or chapter 15, section 2 of the respiratory system. Last time we looked at the anatomy or the parts. Today we're going to look at the physiology or the way that those parts function. So, to do so, we've got to talk about the respiratory process, which has 3 overall phases or key parts, the first of which is ventilation, which is where we move air between us and the atmosphere. So, really, atmosphere and the lungs. Then we've got external respiration. The way I like to describe this is going to be our pulmonary circulation, because this is where we see the exchange of gases between the lungs and our blood. And last but not least, we have internal respiration, which again I like to describe as systemic circulation. So this is the exchange of gases between blood and all other major body tissues. When we break down each of these portions or pieces, we've got to start with ventilation. Ventilation is regulated by our respiratory centers in the brain, as well as your respiratory muscles. So, a throwback to chapter 12, our brain respiratory centers are the medulla and pons. These are going to make sure that we adjust breathing rate accordingly to whatever activity we are engaged in. So, the way you breathe in your deepest of sleep versus the way you breathe right now, and the way you would breathe if we got to kick it old school and we didn't have to socially distance and we could all be together running up and down the bleachers like we once did. Tear. Our respiratory muscles, like we mentioned last class, would be our internal and external intercostal muscles that weave through the ribs, as well as the dome-shaped diaphragm. The result of our respiratory muscles moving and contracting will actually cause a change in pressure along with movement, and the pressure changes in the smallest possible piece, our alveoli, or those air sacs, as well as all major parts of our bronchial tree. Now, there are multiple pressure changes that take place, so important pressures for us to be aware of. There are 3. First of which is our atmospheric pressure. So, this is the pressure of the air around us if we're at sea level. So this would really be our baseline or homeostasis, if you will. And this is about 760 millimeters of Hg. If you were in class, I would ask those of you to let me know if you knew what element this is on the periodic table. So hopefully some alarm bells were going off telling you that this is mercury. So atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Intrapleural pressure is going to be the pressure between our parietal membranes or our pleural membranes and the lungs. So the actual gap between tissues. So both the parietal and visceral space, or that gap that allows the lungs to inflate and deflate, is our intrapleural pressure. This is slightly lower than atmospheric pressure at about 756 millimeters of mercury. Last pressure is our interpulmonic pressure. This is going to be the pressure within your bronchial tree and all of your air sacs or your alveoli. This pressure is not set at one individual number, as it's going to fluctuate slightly above and slightly below atmospheric pressure depending on what phase of breathing we're in. Inhalation, taking air in, or exhalation, taking air out of the body. When we look at inhalation, another term for this is inspiration. No, not like the quote of the week that you used to see when you came into my classroom, but again, moving air into the body. This as a process is active, meaning we are requiring the body to spend energy on it. This is because we're contracting the muscles and we're using the energy source, ATP. So when the diaphragm contracts, it moves down in order to expand the chest cavity, kind of like that accordion example we talked about way back in semester 1. And your internal and external intercostal muscles will contract, moving your rib cage up and out. If we were in class together, I'd ask you to wrap your hands around your rib cage, take a nice big deep breath in, and note what happens to the rib cage as you do so. This whole process of the movement of muscles causes a negative intrapleural pressure, which then forces the cavity to create a suction, which will expand the lungs and move air into the body. Intrapulmonic pressure at this time is lower than atmospheric pressure, which is why it will expand. Think diffusion. Air will continue to move into the lungs until that pressure is roughly equal to atmospheric pressure, so that's 760 millimeters of mercury. And then we move into releasing that gas or releasing the waste, which is exhalation. Exhalation, also known as expiration, again, not like the dates that are stamped onto most foods. We're just using this term to denote movement of air out of the body. Unlike inhalation or inspiration, this is a passive process. It does not require the body to use any energy. Instead, this is what takes place when all of those muscular tissues begin to relax. So the diaphragm will fold up and in to the pleural cavity right underneath the lungs. Your external intercostals relax and move the rib cage down and back to its homeostatic resting position, which will decrease the space in which the lungs have to expand. This process causes your intrapulmonic pressure to rise above atmospheric pressure. Because of this, it's going to force air out, which will compress both of the lungs until the pressures are once again equal. Now, we've been talking a lot thus far about the movement of air and or the movement of gases. So it's important for us to note what we're talking about, and I'm assuming we're all on the same page. We're talking about oxygen, the nutrient, and carbon dioxide, the waste. The exchange of gases takes place at two sites. That would be the lungs and all other major parts of the body. Because of this, we can again divide it into external respiration and then internal respiration. In external respiration, which again was our pulmonary circulation, we're seeing the exchange between your alveoli, the air sacs, and your pulmonary capillaries. So those that feed blood coming from the heart with oxygen. In internal respiration, we're talking about the exchange between systemic capillaries and all other major body systems. As you can see in the diagram, we are talking about diffusion. So we're always going to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. If we think back way to the start of the year, chapter 3, here, if we're taking a big deep breath in and we're taking a look at this nice diagram, your alveoli are full of oxygen. You've just moved it into the body. So it's going to move from high concentration to low concentration, which would be the blood coming from that right ventricle in our pulmonary circulation. So oxygen is going to diffuse out of your alveoli and into the blood. The reverse can be said if we look at this diagram. Your blood is carrying a high level of carbon dioxide, which is why last chapter we colored it blue. So because of this, it's got an area of high concentration in blood, low concentration in the alveoli. It would then be moving out of that capillary into the alveolus as it's listed in your diagram. As normal, I've embedded a nice little link if you are tired of hearing me talk and are looking for an additional way to absorb and take in this information. Go ahead and use the link. If not, as always, not going to hurt my feelings. So, gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, unfortunately aren't the only thing present in the air around us. In fact, inhaled air consists of a multitude of things, about 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, and about 0.04% carbon dioxide. Now, the body can't do anything with nitrogen in its gaseous form. We don't want it, can't store it, so exhaled air is going to consist of that same amount of nitrogen. Exhaled air also going to consist of about 16% oxygen. We don't need all 21% that we take into the body, so we're going to release what we don't need since we can't store it. However, we're going to release a higher level of carbon dioxide since that is the waste product that's being filtered out of the blood through the lungs at 4.4%. As noted, some oxygen is retained within the body, in fact, about 5%. Carbon dioxide then is coming from all other major body parts that have to carry out cellular respiration. As we move on, so we see all of these pressures of the composition of air, we have to look at then partial pressures, as you can see in that diagram with a whole bunch of numbers all over the place. Those pressures are simply meant, or those numbers rather, to show us the movement or direction of movement for diffusion. So, partial pressures, again, gases are going to diffuse from high to low areas of concentration. Concentration of gases are expressed as a whole as partial pressures, or a capital P. That meaning it's the pressure the gas exerts in a mixture. So nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide. As we've already seen, we measure it in millimeters of mercury. And if we wanted to calculate it, mathematically we could. In fact, to calculate partial pressure of inhaled air, we multiply the amount of oxygen in that air by 760 millimeters of mercury, which is the average, again, at sea level. I'm not going to have you do this mathematically, so for those of you that start to panic, take a deep breath, enjoy those partial pressures, and relax. The partial pressures at sites of this gas exchange change. So external respiration versus internal respiration. So I'm going to pull them all up, and I'm going to show you what we're talking about. So as you can see, we've got external respiration, which again is our pulmonary circulation. So if you look at the percentage or the partial pressure of oxygen in your alveoli, we have a very high amount because, well, you've just taken a big deep breath in. So we've got 105 millimeters of mercury in relation to a relatively low concentration or partial pressure of carbon dioxide at only 40 because, well, we haven't swapped with blood just yet. Your pulmonary arteries that are moving from your heart to your lungs are much higher in carbon dioxide than they are in oxygen because, again, gas exchange hasn't taken place yet. But if we look at our pulmonary veins, they're much higher in oxygen content than carbon dioxide because they're coming back from the lungs and moving into that right atrium of the heart, oxygen rich. In internal respiration, once again, this is our systemic circulation. Body tissues have a low percentage of oxygen because, well, they've used it. So they have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide at 50 millimeters of mercury. In your systemic arteries, these are very rich in oxygen because, well, this is pumped from the left ventricle off through all parts of the aorta, and it's carrying that oxygen needed for all parts of the body. So that's why there's that discrepancy, 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen to 40 millimeters of mercury in carbon dioxide. Last but not least, your systemic veins. They've dropped off the oxygen now at all major body parts. They've picked up the waste product of carbon dioxide. So again, that accounts for the discrepancy of partial pressures. A partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury for oxygen and 45 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide. This last slide is simply to show all of the numeric values that we saw on the past page in relation to our idea of circulation because of the last chapter. I don't need you to panic. I don't need you to feel like you need to memorize these things. I'm not going to test you on it. However, these partial pressures and this last slide is going to come in handy when you take a look at your homework worksheet. Next class, there will be a quiz. In fact, I'm going to assign the quiz as homework. That way you have access to it early. So if you're feeling good about this stuff, you can take it right away. If you want to watch this a few more times or take a look at the slides without me talking, you can do that as well. Otherwise, please use this slide in particular for your homework worksheet. If you have any questions, email me, let me know. Otherwise, I'm missing your bright, shiny faces. And until next time, have a great day.